Right, well I've got some small drill bits. This is a 1.5mm bit. That won't fit in anywhere along that track. This is a 1.4mm bit. Likewise, that won't fit in anywhere either. This one is 1.3. That fits in all the way along that track. And I can't say that there is any sign that it's tighter at one end of the track than the other. We know that the rack functions well in another case. We haven't tested is whether another rack will function correctly in this case. So I suppose that's the next task. Let's try this. What I'm checking is whether there is a very slight distortion on the case and a very slight distortion on the rack, and between them they are creating the stiffness that we're observing. I think we're coming back to it being the case all the time, but I need to rule this out, because if another rack in the same case will behave normally, then that's as good enough solution for us. There's no point looking for trouble. Yeah, again that's the same deal. It's free at this end of the track. And at the other end of the track, it's good until it reaches this point. Then it's stiff. Okay. So it's the case, it's nothing but the case. What have we got? Oh, now that's interesting. I've stretched the case out at this point, and the action of the rack is nice and smooth. Now I did that by pushing the 1.4mm drill bit into the case and just levering it across. Like this. Okay, alright, so I think we're in business. What have we done? Well, we've pulled the case back into line, I believe. So I'll assemble everything back together again and see how it goes. First the flash sync wire. Drop the curved rack into place. Fit here 2 screws. I think that'll be adequate. Put our depth of field, no, our aperture click stops back in place. I'll fit this to the camera body and see if we have a functioning shutter. That's not sitting down in place. Why not? I think that shutter release arm is slightly askew. Let's try that. That's not quite cocking. Still not. It still needs to be advanced further. It's working, but I noticed that there's a little bit of reluctance of the film advance lever to return to the rest position. Which means that there's still some residual tightness in that rack, I believe. is the film advance is working more than adequately without the shutter in place. More work required, I think. Back later. As you can see, that film advance lever now returns to the rest position by itself. No problems at all, no stiffness. What did I do? Well, basically on the back of the shutter, I removed the screw that sits at this position. That's our locating screw. I stretched the case wider at this point, pulled it wider, and then put the screw back in. Now, this hole obviously had a little bit of slop in it, but by stretching that case wider, that was all that was required to make the action of that rack nice and smooth. I don't think that camera's going to focus for us, is it? Stupid camera. Now I have to check the focus, because of course we've changed the rear component in the lens. The focus scale ring was absolutely covered in conflicting scratch marks where alignments had been made previously, and as I noted, the shutter has no paper or metal shims on the back, which would have been used to adjust the shutter and lens assembly to the body during manufacture. So I've got to test my focus and probably either use shims to adjust the focus if it requires shims, if the lens needs to be further away from the body, or adjust the position of the focus scale ring on the focus helical, which I'll certainly need to do if the lens and shutter assembly needs to be further back in the body to achieve correct focus. Alright, I have my lens focused correctly, so that part's good. I'm going to remove the top of the camera now, which needs to be cleaned up, and once the top of the camera is off, I can fit the rangefinder, get that adjusted. When the rangefinder and everything else has been adjusted and the top cover's been cleaned up, I'll still want to come back and check the frame counter, which, as I said, is registering about 1 notch out. In other words, that the end of film lock engages when the frame counter says frame 2 instead of when it says frame 1. That could be disconcerting, so I will look to sort that problem out. It may be that I never get better than the film lock engaging at frame 1.5, but we'll deal with that when we have to. The top of the camera is all good there, that's all clean, ready to go. Everything else in place. I'm checking my rangefinder. This has all been taken apart, cleaned with the ultrasonic cleaner, or those parts that required cleaning with the ultrasonic cleaner have been cleaned there. Just making sure I remove any fingerprints I've managed to deposit, and any dust that's settled in the last day or so. That prism doesn't look particularly good, and I'm trying to get an impression of which surface those marks are on. The prism effectively has 3 surfaces. The front surface, obviously, this angled surface here, and then there's a plain surface inside the body of the rangefinder here. I can see some marks on there and I don't know whether it is deteriorated silver on the back of the prism or whether it's on the glass inside. So I think the best thing to do is remove that prism and have a look. That surface there doesn't look good. Let's see if it'll improves any. I'm checking the result I'm getting. I'm looking through there, just looking for smears. It's not as sparkly as I would like. I suspect it's a slight film of some oily haze has settled on that glass. Of course, we're sort of keyhole surgery here. Yeah, that's certainly what I think I'm seeing, is it's like an oily haze. That could take some getting rid of. It is possible to dismantle this and take the prism off, but it's glued in, it's held in with a single screw and it's glued in place, cemented in place. The likelihood of you damaging the silvering on the back is pretty high. So generally speaking, I wouldn't do it. This is the easiest way, using a cotton bud in through the end, rotating it, manipulating it to cover that surface. And you can also take some fine threads of cotton bud and wrap it around a toothpick, effectively creating a tiny cotton bud, and then you can poke that into the hole at the end and manipulate it to get access to the corners, if you like, if that's going to help. That looks a lot better. I'll blow the dust out of there. And check again. No, that looks nice. These two screws hold the prism in. They also control the alignment, the vertical alignment of your rangefinder image. So I'm doing those up lightly. They don't need to be done up tight. I'll be making some adjustments. So for the rangefinder, what do we want? Well, normally I'll put a little bit of molybdenum paste on the cam surface here. That's where this post is drawn forward by the focus ring. And what I do is I put a tiny drop of lacquer on the four corners of the mounting post of the rangefinder. And that is so that once it's screwed down tightly in place, it cannot shift. Rangefinders have a well-known ability to get out of adjustment if the rangefinder has shifted in position when the camera has been dropped. it's not dowelled in position. It's held in position with 2 screws. And a little bit of lacquer helps lock it in place. The screws are done up tight. But the lacquer doesn't stop that coming off. At a later date, when you want to come back and service the camera, you'll find that the screws will remove just as they normally would. And that lacquer will be no obstacle to removing the rangefinder at that point. Alright, so now I can check the alignment of my image. Back shortly. Well, that rangefinder is all good. The alignment of the images. Vertical alignment of your rangefinder images are controlled by these 2 screws here and here. As you move the focus ring backwards and forwards, you'll see that one of the images in the finder moves and the other one is stationary. If the moving image is high, you need to tighten slightly this rear screw, loosen slightly the front screw. Now when I say tighten and loosen, you are moving in very, very small amounts. If the moving image is low, you'd need to loosen the rear screw, tighten the front screw until the vertical alignment is correct. For horizontal alignment, normally you would use an infinity target. That's a suitable target at or close to infinity. Normally you would use a radio mast, a telegraph pole, something of that nature. And looking out my window, I have got a flagpole and then a series of telegraph poles running up the hill from that. So the flagpole from here would be 200 or 300 metres. The power poles would be 400 or 500 metres. I can use those to set my focus distance, my alignment for my rangefinder, and typically I would be looking so that the most distant of those objects, the ones that are right up on the horizon from here, that the images just coincide as the focus scale ring is moved round to the infinity position. And as soon as the focus scale ring is moved away from the infinity position, you would notice that the images diverge in the rangefinder. Adjustments for the horizontal adjustment on a rangefinder like this. I'll zoom you in a bit. This is a Retina IIa. This is the pivot point. You don't need to disturb that, that's the hinge. This screw here, the one in the middle, there's 5 visible screws here. The one in the middle, that's the lock screw that locks your setting. You loosen that very slightly. Your adjustments for the infinity position are made by rotating this screw slightly, which it's an eccentric and it'll just shift that whole cam plate in or out. If you loosen up the lock screw too much, you'll find that it won't stay fixed in any useful position, and it's a bugger trying to make adjustments. So you need a certain amount of drag on that. A good size screwdriver, very fine adjustments on the adjustment screw is normally what's required. That brings us to these 2 screws at the end of the arm. Now, one of them here, that's the lock screw. The other one controls the position, that's the pivot effectively. This little segment here, this little plate, can be swung backwards or forwards to adjust its position, and basically what it does is it adjusts the angle of the plate that's attached on the end of the arm, so that as the focus moves in or out, the pin pulls in or out, it's either going to come up further away or closer depending on the angle of that plate. And what that does is it allows you to make a fine adjustment so that you can get your infinity focus correct and get a correct alignment at a close focusing distance by adjusting the effective angle of that arm at that point. Now, I would advise you to leave that well alone unless you have a serious problem. As soon as you disturb the position of the close focus adjustment, you will find that the infinity position is also gone, of course, and then you have to put that back in place and then check the close focus adjustment, then the infinity adjustment and the close focus adjustment, and you work backwards and forwards until you get them both correct. It's a very tedious process, but not impossible, of course. Alright, so our camera here is now ready to have the top back on it. I'll pop that to one side because I need to clean up the top cover. I'm not the first person to have this camera apart, and as I've probably said, it was someone's failed repair attempt. Various things were wrong with it, but I'm just going to strip this down now and clean it up. So I'm going to remove the flash screw. I'm very careful not to slip with those screws because otherwise you would damage the chrome either on the screw or on the top cover or on the flash shoe itself. The chrome plating is satin chrome on brass. It's extremely thin, it's extremely easily damaged, and you put marks in it, you'll never ever get them out. Now our film reminder dial, oh, that's not going to move. I'm going to check the action of that. That's smooth enough. I don't think I need to fight with that. This is the centre boss here is threaded in. Now basically my tool of choice usually is the end of my steel rule, or scale as they call it in the States, and I normally use that to turn that and rotate it and unscrew it. That's extremely tight. I'm not fighting with it. The chances of slipping off and making a mess are very, very high. You'll see that here on the film reminder dial, you lift it up to rotate it and it drops back against spring pressure, and there's a little pin on the top cover, little series of holes on the bottom side of this ring. That's fine, that's good. You'll notice that this ring is very brassy. That's not uncommon, unfortunately. On this model I don't remember seeing a good example. So now I'm going to remove these two screws, which will remove this frame. I'll take the glass out, clean those. I'll clean the rear glass for the viewfinder lens and then put it all back together. And meantime my video camera is complaining bitterly that the battery is about to die, so I'll stop at this point. I'll come back when I've got everything back and going again.